Nearly 2 weeks now after the massacre at a church in Charleston, and we are learning more about the crime, how it happened, and the high school dropout accused of the deadly rampage, from drug use on the part of the suspect to a hate-filled manifesto published online to his desire to start a race war. I'm joined now by the Ebru think tank, Uhura Williams, Vice President of Academic Affairs at Fairfield University. Joining us live via our DC connection is Robert Chase, History Professor at Stony Brook University. Here in the studio with us is the Reverend Pritchett, educator and mentor from Seton Hall University. And also joining me today is Professor F. Michael Higginbottam, internationally renowned scholar and author of the book Ghosts of Jim Crow. Reverend Pritchett, since you're our new guest, I'll start with you. Everybody feels horrible about this tragedy.
Yes, sir.
It has united America in grief, unless you're crazy. And the crazy part's what I want to emphasize right now. And maybe it is my white privilege talking, but I view this crime not as a crime of race, but I view this crime as a crime of crazy. That this nut could have latched onto any kind of ideology and committed a horrific act so he could be a celebrity like he is today.
Certainly.
And in fact, he was even contemplating a school shooting. What are your thoughts on my take of it, that this is a crime of crazy, not a crime of racism?
If we were using a contemporary analysis, that might prove to be the correct outcome. If we look at a historical analysis, we would see this pattern has been repeated for hundreds of years in this country. I believe we can look at the first independent black church that might have been established. It had a white minister who preached. He wanted to have a separate church for the Negro population because they were segregated as they sat there with their white masters. 1 week after he preached, they burned the church down. So we can trace incidents of terror for hundreds of years. Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, when he arrived in Montgomery, he wasn't selected to be the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association movement just because he was an eloquent speaker. He was selected because those other ministers knew that there'd be a great probability they could be killed, their churches could be burned, and their homes could be bombed. King was selected because he was the youngest person in town, and that indeed there was a high probability that he might become the victim of that act of terrorism also. So I think that historical paradigm gives us a lot more clarity on this understanding to say this is nothing more than a manifestation of the most contemporary aspects of that same pattern of terror.
Uhura, I'll ask you your take on it. I'd also like to get your impressions on President Obama yesterday. For me, I thought he really elevated his position in the United States and the world, not necessarily as a president, but as a civil rights leader. I mean, with his stance on this crime and with his stance on gay rights, the illumination of the White House in the rainbow colors yesterday. I'd like to get your take on my take on that.
The president is very eloquent. I do have a problem with the symbolism that goes along with some of this because, again, while we can look at concrete gains with regard to the Supreme Court and its recent ruling with regard to same-sex marriage, we have not had that kind of groundswell when it comes to issues of policing, race, crime, the access of firearms. Professor Chase mentioned a few minutes ago the Voting Rights Act and the fact that part of that is being taken back. And we have to look at this in the context of this report that came out of Ferguson, the Attorney General talking about real problems that exist on the ground, problems of inequality, of policing, so on and so forth. Until we see substantive movement in that area, I think that people will look at Obama's administration and may pronounce it in this area, this arena in particular, a failure for these reasons. The president has become mourner in chief. He is so eloquent. He's so great at making us feel these moments of reconciliation that we can come together and celebrate the fact that we share this great democracy and we have to move forward. And then people walk away and they do nothing. It was one of the critiques of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. One of his nicknames among some of his critics was the Lord. And they joked that way because he would give these eloquent sermons. And then when he would go away, people would sit around waiting for the second coming. You know, and they would not be engaged in acts of civil disobedience and other things that might move the discussion and dialogue forward. I think that in some sense, Obama's greatest strength is also in some sense what paralyzes people because it doesn't produce anything other than that moment, that opportunity for him to give a wonderful 40-minute speech, and then people walk away and forget that we have a responsibility collectively to address these issues as a nation.
Let me have you talk about that, Michael. Is part of the problem President Obama himself, that he's using the bully pulpit effectively by making powerful sermons from the White House and from churches like we saw in Charleston yesterday, but he's failing to reach the compromises in Congress needed to get powerful legislation enacted? Maybe this is a time to pass some legislation that would benefit people who are discriminated against.
Well, I'm a big believer in positive laws making a difference. I think much of the progress that has occurred in this country has been a result of those positive laws, such as Brown versus Board of Education and other Supreme Court decisions, and we saw a few this week that I think will have a tremendous impact as well. But I don't fault the president so much as I fault Congress on this. I really think the president has put forward some concrete pieces of legislation that should really be considered. For example, just a few days ago, there was legislation put forward on a new Voting Rights Act. This is the Voting Rights Act, the most democratizing piece of legislation we've ever had passed in this country. And what the Supreme Court did in Shelby, I think, was anti-democratic. We should be encouraging people to participate in the voting process, not discouraging them. And so I think that President Obama has put forward, we'll see what happens with this new Voting Rights Act, but I think that he's put forward an American Jobs Act. I mean, if you look at the disparities between the races in terms of unemployment, there's a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 difference in black men under 40 in terms of employment. And when you look at that, President Obama put forward an American Jobs Act when he first became president. It still hasn't been voted on by Congress. This would target areas of super high unemployment. Most of these areas are racial minorities are the majority in these areas, and it would make a huge difference in reducing the unemployment.
Let's turn to Robert Chase. Robert, to that I would say, as a free market capitalist, is, hey, let's make a deal. I mean, this is where I think President Obama's shortcomings are, where he needs to reach across the aisle and find some common ground to make some of that legislation that you want passed happen. President Reagan did it with a Democratic Congress. President Clinton did it with a Republican Congress. You can find areas of compromise, correct?
Well, I think actually this president cannot find areas of compromise, which I don't think is his fault. We have a Congress that has decided from really days after his election, as they stated when they met together, to ensure that Obama's agenda cannot be passed. But I'd like to draw two larger points here. The first is that civil rights can't just look to the federal level. They really have to turn more to the state level, which is where, say, the Koch brothers have aimed the conservative agenda. We have to look at who are our governors, what are our state legislature are doing, what are the laws surrounding policing, stand your ground laws, mass incarceration, because a lot of these issues that some of the other guests have raised shouldn't just be addressed at the federal level. They have to be addressed at the state level, because that's where the power of state government is employed in all of these repressive forces. And then very briefly, a second point about Dylann Roof as an individual, someone insane as opposed to a terrorist. Listen, Dylann Roof's manifesto said quite clearly that what he was aiming at was returning an American South, and that we ought to look to history to do it. And what he wanted to do quite clearly was to associate himself with the lost cause of the Confederacy. The idea that we would have an ennobled white South built on the racial oppression of African Americans. And he wanted to return to that ideology. And I would say that that is not just a lone wolf idea, but an idea of domestic white terrorism that stretches back to the 19th century and indeed looks forward by associating himself with what he believes to be imperiled whites in Europe, for instance. And it also has a global dimension as well as a domestic.
Thank you for your thoughts. I want to turn to the Reverend Pritchett. I found this like an interesting paradox as I read up on Dylann Roof. He's unemployed. He basically dropped out of school in 9th grade after doing it twice. He was using drugs. He had been arrested. He was facing some of the same problems that you guys are proposing to address for the black community. He seemed to be suffering from those very same ills.
Yes, sir.
Any thoughts on that? I know it's kind of an odd
Combination,
take,
but there's one other ingredient that he possesses that many of us do not, and I would call it white resentment. They resent the progress of the last 100 years. They're looking, I think, to...
Strange, though, I don't mean to interrupt you,
Sure.
but he also had a great number of black friends,
Sure.
which I thought was strange. I mean, for somebody who seems so hate-filled, that's what makes me think he's more crazy than racist, but I want to hear more of your thoughts.
I could say the psychotic mind has many dimensions to it. We can leave that issue to psychologists to figure out. In today's generation, so many young people also, I think, have a bi-level of their relationships. They may appear to be simply friends on another level and away from that influence.
So they're able to actually segregate, well, he's my good
It's
black
almost
friend
a
as opposed to the
social
bad blacks out
schizophrenia,
there.
literally, a social. They can separate themselves, but the reality is they are simply covering their true motives and intentions.
Let me get you back on track here with the big story today, which is the shooting at the church. If one good thing were to come out of this, and we're going to wrap up this segment after this question,
Sure.
What would you want that to be? What do you see coming out of this that could be a positive, that we could look at the Reverend Clementa Pritchett, is it?
Yes.
And his life was taken.
I would hope that many Americans could view this as beyond, I could say, the racial implications. When I combine the look at shootings taking place in school settings, little harmless children, and then we'll say the church setting, I see the loss of the sacred. If we're talking about an American civilization, we all have to work together to see to it that all of the tenets of democracy are manifested for all Americans. This is almost, it may push us to the point of a rebirth of the American democracy and what it means to be free and how do we exercise that freedom. Within that parallel, we've got additional issues, be they gender issues and racial issues. And I think the racial issues have the longer standing struggle that we could deal with. But this is going to be a real challenge for American democracy in the 21st century.
And I think you picked up on this before. It was interesting, and I'm taking your words now and addressing them to your hero. We talked about the White House being draped in rainbow colors. Why wasn't it draped in the Afro-American colors when this tragedy befell the 9 in Charleston? I mean, so like you said, you can never. Where do you stop it? I mean, are you going to light up the White House for a different occasion all the time, and only choose some groups over another?
What you ultimately would hope is that what we celebrate in the United States is our core democratic values that are expressed in our foundational documents, the aspirational language of the Declaration of Independence. I think you spoke very powerfully to this in this context. What the president has attempted to do, because I also agree with Professor Chase that he's reached across the aisle, is to say we as Americans have a responsibility to address some of this. And what he's getting back are these deeply entrenched, and you talked about this in your book, Michael, these deeply entrenched ideas, this privilege that goes along with this resentment that comes from a guy like Dylan Roof, who says, instead of addressing the issues of poverty, I don't have because this person of color has taken my place. That's where we really need to focus our attention in the upcoming century to address some of that, because the idea is that we go back to the Bakke case in the 1970s. But for this person of color, that's my seat at that university, that's my job, as opposed to we've got to deal with the issues of joblessness, inadequate minimum wage, all these issues that, and quite frankly, to sum up, this is what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King ended his life with, the Poor People's Campaign. That's where the civil rights movement was headed.
And we're going to actually have a little bit more on that in our next segment. We're going to be talking about raising the minimum wage. It's happening in cities across the country. Is it too little, too late? Is it enough? Is it too much? More on that.